Hello, everybody. It's very, very nice to see you all here today. Welcome in, welcome in. It's good to have everybody back. Welcome to Conversations with Authors. Today we're bringing to you Teresa K. Miller and Elmaz Abinader. The author, Teresa K., who wrote Borderline Fortune, and Elmaz Abinader, who wrote a lot of things, but This House, My Bones, I believe is the most recent. But before we get to our authors properly, allow me to welcome you to Book Passage's Conversations with Authors. If you've seen one of these events before, well then, welcome back. We're glad to see you again. But if you're completely new here, then Book Passage is a group of independently run bookstores out of the San Francisco Bay Area, one in Corte Madera, one in the San Francisco Ferry Building, and we host and run book talks just like these in our physical stores pretty often throughout the week. But as we are now streaming on YouTube, and will continue to do so in the future, please consider subscribing by clicking the subscribe button just below the video. It's completely free to you, and it helps us out a lot, and it alerts the YouTube overlords that you enjoy our content and pushes it out to even more people who can get even more excellent book content. So I really appreciate it. And additionally, if you click that little bell right next to the subscribe button, you'll be alerted every single time that we go live with author talks just like these, or sometimes with pre-recorded author content every once in a while. And you might even find that there's an event that's coming up that you didn't even know you'd like, that you join up and have a good time with. It's really up to you. If you would like to check out our upcoming events or just like the idea of an email newsletter more, you can find both of those at bookpassage.com. And if you'd like to check out either of our speakers' books that are mentioned here tonight, you can find them in the description below the video, or from me spamming it in the YouTube chat periodically, or again at bookpassage.com. And lastly, and this one's very important, if you have any questions for tonight's speakers, please take the time to write them in the YouTube chat. It's the only way to get your questions to them, so don't miss out on your chance. I would write them as you think of them, because later you might forget. Now, allow me to introduce a graduate of Barnard College and the Mills College MFA program. Teresa K. Miller is the author of Sped, Forever No Low, and as well as a co-editor of Food First, selected writings from 40 years of movement building. Her poems and essays have appeared in Ziziva, Alternet, Entropy, Diagram, and elsewhere. Originally from Seattle, she tends a mini orchard near Portland, Oregon. Elmaz Abinader is an author and a performer. Her most recent poetry collection, This House, My Bones, was the editor's selection for 2014 from Willow's Books/Aquarius. Her other books include a memoir, Children of the Room, A Family's Journey from Lebanon, and a book of poetry, In the Country of My Dreams, which won the Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Award. She teaches at Mills College, pretty close to where I live, and is an instructor at the Oakland YMCA. Thank you very much to the both of them for coming out. I'll get off the screen now. We can actually go on for the things. Welcome, Elmaz. Welcome, Teresa.
Thanks so much for having us. Thank you, Nick, for moderating, and thanks to Book Passage for hosting. Thank you, Elmaz, for being part of this. I've just been looking forward to this so much. I'm super honored to be in conversation with you tonight. And just so that everyone knows, we're speaking to each other. We can see each other, but we're speaking into the abyss a little bit as far as the audience. But we know that you're out there, and so appreciative of you listening in tonight. And if you do have questions or comments as we go along, Nick will be putting those into the Zoom chat that we're using to broadcast this. So I'm coming to you from just south of Portland, Oregon, unincorporated Clackamas County, which is also unceded land of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. And we're going to be reading some poems tonight that are in conversation with each other in ways across geography and across time, and even the books talking across time, but hopefully sparking some resonance and some themes to share with you, and just super, super glad to be here. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Elmaz, and we'll dive into some poems.
Well, thank you, Teresa. I'm pretty excited to be here too. Book Passage is one of my favorite places in the Bay Area. So if you're not a fan yet, become a fan. Go to the live stores. They're really wonderful and always give you what you need. And so I'm really happy to be here. And then I'm really honored to be part of Teresa's reading. This book is beautiful. And I think it's kind of appropriate that we're reading together when Thanksgiving is coming up, where we have the perfect example of occupation of land. And we're talking about borders and frontiers, and we're talking about occupation, and we're talking about losing and grieving. land. So here we are on occupied land, and we're going to read these poems and have that conversation. So that might be something you want to join in. I am starting with a poem called Preparing for Occupation. It's from my first poetry book, In the Country of My Dreams. And I'll be following it with one other poem from This House, My Bones. Preparing for Occupation. Buy only short books, ones that read quickly with plots you can keep track of when the pounding starts on the door. Drive no nails into the wall, no pictures, no pencil sharpener or mirror. Your face doesn't matter. You are no one. Teach your children at home or leave them idle to wander the streets to find a funeral parade, a crowd to join. Use only votive candles so they can burn out before morning. Stash your cigarettes in your pocket. Leave nothing in the cupboards to remind them but a child's toy. Adopt no pets. Hook up no phones. Print no card, address, labels, or stationery. Test your batteries daily. All your clothes must be light in similar colors and never need ironing. Your only family heirlooms are habit, memory, name, and song. Believe that placing your daughter upon your shoulders will be home enough as she feels for something familiar. Avoid meeting neighbors unless you've known them since birth. Be careful of the bird flirting with you in the yard. One of you may soon fly away. One of you has migratory patterns. You've been here thousands of years, but aren't your people nomadic anyway? Can't you pitch a tent in a grove on the outskirts, move in with relatives, cross into another country, clogging the border with shanty towns, waiting to return? I've seen you together. You prefer to be together. Because this house bears the prints of your children upon the wall, because the kitchen is furrowed from your journeys made, from the table to the stove to the table, because the floor is pocked from the weight of your Davenport doesn't mean you can't move on. The walls have echoed your voices, your sighs floated up to the ceiling and gathered like clouds in a refugee sky. Remember the time your son opened the door so quickly the bottle flew off the table and around the room? Grains are in the corner still. You will miss nothing. The refrigerator, the window that refuses to open, the sputtering light of the refrigerator, the leaky pipe in the girls' room, the cat that crosses the fence in the morning. He is not your family, although you recognize him. This is not your town, although you've walked its streets on your wedding day. Local water mixes with your blood. This is not your country, despite its dust covering your shoes, the songs you have memorized, the poets you claim as your own. Don't look down, look up. When the geese are passing in their V formation, join them. Tuck your treasures under your wing. From the refugee sky, you can count the bodies below you. Examine the shipwreck of your home while others pick through its remains. Okay, so switching on to This House, My Bones is a poem called Falling into the Ocean. And it's actually about California, but you can see some echo. And its epigram is Adrian Rich from North American Time. You are not accountable to the life of your tribe, the breath of your planet. Falling into the ocean. The town he grew up is falling into the ocean. He is unmoved by the sinking. The sea is reclaiming its turf, he says. The surrender is predictable, and watches the building where he stayed with his father sink into its hips and crack an arrow into the stucco, pointing to the cloudy, always sky. He turns his back on it and the beach where he lived. It's just that easy to let go, you wonder, of home or homeland, of tribe or country. Drift on water between there and here and not look back. Empty the sand that once ran through your fingers, gripped and release. You're not sure half the time where you are. House is different. Home is different from homeland. One you hold and one slips away. One burns in the atmosphere, is abandoned. Pieces fall in unknown territories and are absorbed into the land. He studies what's under the earth, not what's on top of it. Listens for seismic echoes, follows the liquefaction, water floating in sand, siphoning out, a hypertension signaling the first rumbles, a schism of crust, the heart breaking, leaving a story behind that strangers tell each other without pity for the ground below. His stories are subterranean, the confinement of fire giving way. In exile, we write of lost cities, countries that form the friction ridges on our fingerprints. Every story pushes harder, as if articulation is redemption, or at least allows us to point to a place on the map where the house once stood. Maybe all of that, houses, schools, roads, and churches, even the neighbors are less the point when the foundation gives way. Everything can be lost just that quick. His relationship with memory is scant. He numbers the stories that are told and well rehearsed, almost if they hadn't happened, like the home by the sea. They sink slowly, not into the ground or into the ocean, but into the skin. So tough, we leave bits of it behind everywhere we go. We must be aware of everything below. What skins materialize when lying fallow? What conjuring stirs up this earth? Step lightly, keep moving. Home is up ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz, for starting us off with those. They're beautiful, and I'm looking forward to talking about them. What some of the audience may know and some may not know is Almaz was my academic advisor at Mills for both years, and also, no exaggeration, the reason that I finished my MFA. My father was killed my second semester of my second year. So I was in the home stretch and my entire world imploded. And that's definitely what my first book, Sped, is about. And it certainly plays a role in this new collection, Borderline Fortune. But Almaz just brought this immediate, clear compassion and support, and it was completely authentic and genuine. And she looked me in the eye and said, "You came this far and you've been doing great, and I'm not going to let this be why you don't finish." And just having that support suddenly opened up, like, oh, I can do this. I can take a breath, and then I can go back and I can do my work. But someone sees me. And so I just want to bring that gratitude into the space. And that's one of the many reasons why I'm honored to be here tonight with you, because I wouldn't be here without Almaz and her example, and just some strange resonances. I trained as an aerobics instructor and a personal trainer in college. And so to get to Mills and have my academic advisor be like, "Yeah, I teach aerobics at the YMCA. You can do both. You can be a writer and inhabit your body." And that's something that very much comes through in This House, My Bones as well, that we can talk about. So just to bring all that into the space, because my gratitude is genuine, my admiration is vast. So to talk about these poems, I'll just briefly say I've been thinking about them like a braid, and the three strands are the intrapersonal, the interpersonal, and the ecological. Specifically concerned with the illusion of separation. So parts of the mind warring with each other, the illusion of separation from others, particularly within family systems, and then the illusion of separation from the planet, which has brought all manner of cataclysm to our door, particularly in the past year, and specifically where I live in Clackamas County, but around the world, we can see it even today, even in Washington, just north of me. I-5 is closed for a long stretch because of the flooding. So all of those pieces are coming together in these poems. And the pieces themselves are untitled. I came here to conjure you. What may I say? Anything, all of it. Friction on the flint, many-armed agent of entropy. What wrath would I risk reaping? What disowning? Who bore me to the shore, pressed me under, dragged there, ragged gasps? If I am already orphaned, why fear orphaning? This splintered boom in my hand. I inherited not a house, but the memory of a house. The stranger camouflaged, stretched shadow before breaching the cellar, white paint grit stained. We cannot ever be alone. Broad day, rain mixed with snow. No harm, no me for 2 generations, no place I could touch except in sleep to say at last, but I didn't live here. So my dragon was a paper lantern, never even wild. When the moth-eaten phantoms tire, may we choke ourselves awake. I'm asking you to believe in what you've never seen or heard. Still, listen. It will save you. Don't misunderstand. No personal God will resurrect to offer grace. No reward waits on the other side of suffering. Instead, imagine your skull dissolved. Not your temporal armor, but the rampart you think you stare from. No longer the sound of the bird's chirp or the car passing, but movement in the plane where your head used to be. Can you find that place? She will swing from her bow, but you'll have nothing left to break. Dregs cast, camper top torn and bent in the shadow, the continent's highest peak, towns of circling corvids, junctions, ghosts. How will I learn your chaos? Never sprang from me, wasn't mine, this pile of pointless rubble. Thank you. So we have these pieces that are different formally and coming from different experiences, but then also in some way grappling with home and with memory and with landscape. And it occurred to me as I was, reading through, your original suggestions, I've never specifically heard you describe yourself as an eco-poet or as falling under the banner of eco-poetics. Maybe I've just missed it. But there are certainly elements of that, of the body becoming a landscape and the landscape moving through the bloodstream in some cases in your work. And so I was curious about that idea of home and landscape in your pieces.
Oh, thank you for asking that. And it's true. I've never been categorized that way. And I don't think because other kinds of categories float to the top. Arab American, having lived in Palestine and other parts of the Middle East, all these things float to the top. And the deep connection that I have with the earth and the beliefs I have about how when we are terrorized and the earth is terrorized, it's a complete and total connected change, a shift, an atmospheric shift. And I really do believe that. So thank you for noticing that. But This House My Bones was really, in all the descriptions that I gave, very much about the attack on the nervous system that happens because we occupy, because we invade, because we ruin the environment, because we put microwaves into the sky, because we, all these things. And so we start to erode. And I think that we have to see those connections, that I am a cliff who's being assaulted by water and wind, and that water and wind can take form of any kind of man-made or natural disaster or incurred disaster. So yeah, that's a great observation, and I'm glad. I think I'll put that after my name now. That you brought that up. But one of the things,
yeah, well, it just struck me. I just thought, why isn't this book listed in kind of the examples of eco poetry? Because I'm like, this is quintessentially eco poetry, but I know it's also a banner that it's a label that not everyone claims. So
right, and even in the first book, in The Country of My Dreams, one of the parts of it was kind of shock that I went through moving from New York to Nebraska, because I lived in Nebraska for a while, and what happens when your eyes start to have a relationship with more land than it's ever had before, or more sky than it's ever had before, or more importantly, more weather than it's ever had before. And so that book as well is talking about all of that. It's interesting though, because it's the one thing, and this is what I'm hearing echoing in your work, it's the one thing we can't control, that we can't control. We can say, okay, we're going to try to take care of climate change, but there are ways that the earth is going to change, and the way change is going to happen to us that is completely out of our control. And I think that what I keep seeing in your in these pieces that you just read and throughout the book is you look at the remains and you keep going, what's in it for me, and how do I interpret it, and how do I tell my story when there is so much that's debris and not that much that is whole. So that's one of the things that one of the ways that I think that we are connecting in this group of poems.
Yeah, I agree with that. There was something that jumped out at me, that, to your question, and I can talk about my pieces as well. But in your last poem, which I know you're not reading tonight, but you say life in retelling becomes madness, a perfect exhibition of the pathology of memory and its insistence. And there's a tension through both of our books, I think, with the blessing and the curse of memory, and the essential nature and the self-torture, and multiple speakers. I mean, I had noticed kind of multiple speakers going on in the first poem you read in Preparing for Occupation, but you really brought that out as a performer in the voices that you bring to it, where it starts out like maybe maybe the speaker is talking to herself, or like these are the practical matters, and then suddenly it becomes clear, this is what larger society has inflicted. This is what the occupying forces have inflicted, or this is, the society that absorbs refugees has inflicted, as, here's how you should handle it, or here's how, here's how I would do it, not having any empathy, for how rooted we are in our homes and in our homeland. And that's another interesting distinction, that you're making in your work, or the difference between the home and the homeland. So maybe that's something else that we can talk about. But yeah, the rubble and the fragmentation, particularly ecologically, partly as an illusion and partly as a reality. So as I said, when I was introducing the pieces, I do think there's an illusion of separation from the planet, and some of the terror that we feel is based on what's really happening. And some of it is based on that feeling of loss of control of, wait, if I'm in an extractivist mode and I come from a long line of extractors, and suddenly I'm in the generation where I can't just push a button and get what I want anymore, and the weather's going to come to waste me, then that's very disorienting. And I was actually just reading a piece last night by Dr. Whitney Bauman, who's at Florida International University, talking about the intersections between ecology and theology and queer theory, and how queer theory might have something to offer us as far as getting out of those binaries, and just the idea that if we are no longer married to the idea of progress, then there is something self-serving in a good way in being able to mitigate climate change, because we're no longer trying to extract, and we're also no longer trying to impose a particular human-centered narrative on how this should turn out. So I thought that was kind of a interesting approach. But yeah, to go back to that idea of home versus homeland, and the torture of memory and objects is something else that's resonating between our books. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed about unhoused people in the U.S. is they collect things and create these the same way we collect them in our house. We just put them in shelves, not in grocery carts. And one of the things I noticed about unhoused people in other countries is they don't have things. They don't have a collection of things around them. So there's always this kind of illusion that we have things that are ours. They are ours. We paid money for them and we selected them and stuff like that. But what's really ours is what what it comes from our breath and what our hair falling out and our interactions that take place in the atmosphere. And it's kind of a way to say to myself, what are you valuing and how are you identifying yourself? And so I think that's also, it also rubs up against this idea that we're going to have an estate, and an estate is going to be how our family is defined or how we're defined. And so that constant feeling of ownership that we feel is something that grows to national level. So the country owns something, or the country houses something, or the country can occupy something because it believes in ownership. So we're living this in all of these radiations out to this larger occupying force idea that we have. And so that's why I always say, for me, the revolution's in the kitchen. That's why I always like to deal with the minutia of life rather than the larger political story, because the larger political story really does shrink down to the minutia of life. And I don't know, does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And I remember going to your book launch at Laurel Bookstore for This House of My Bones, and you talking about you like to tell the stories from the kitchen. And that's a line that your book walks so well between the political and the personal. And, you know, people talk about the personal as political, but I feel like it's easy to fall into a trap of either leaning into ideology or leaning into individualism. And something that poetry has the potential to do is, you know, to stay in the unresolved. And your book in particular seems committed to a lack of choosing, a lack of resolution, to say, you know, these individual stories are very political and the political affects the individual. But there's such an intense empathy, I would say, in your work that doesn't get sentimental, and it doesn't get bitter, and it doesn't, I don't know. It's really, it's amazing. It's such a remarkable book. So I feel so glad to hear you read those pieces. I'd love to hear you read the other two from the second pairing, and maybe we can keep riffing because they all kind of tie together.
All right, thank you. And I still want to talk about your book more. You're being so generous. Okay, so the next two are both from This House of My Bones. They're a little more, well, we'll see what they are. All right, the first one is called Save Yourself, Remember Nothing. Stones on the eyes, flatten brown light to dark. A blink shudders the thing we don't mean to see, yet a constant reminder hangs like a sty in every corner. Flashes blepharospasm, a body lying in the grass, a scar on a child's leg, a writer scratching apparitions. Rubbing eyes harshly only burns them. Clean the lenses, rinse cool, blow on tips for small relief. Floaters obscure lashes, impossible to clear. Rake the eyelid. The lacrimal nerves sing so the whole body shudders, and the eyes fall heavy and still. Forever, the ultimate fear is losing a piece of our mind, of drawing a blank at the faces of loved ones, and to know their names or why they have come, baffled by the repetition, speech insistent, slow enough to bring memory to the foreground. Here's what to remember. It's still in our skin. Our veins wash corpuscles, flow sea pebbles into the archive. Each canal collects the moment where she paused and thought for a minute, then couldn't recall. That moment is suspended, quiet. This is vital. We reshape like cliffs, sides buffering the sea. Take a long look and recognize the width of the hips, yours, hers, the stance of legs, the pronouncement of jaw. We blister from the countless times we have relived year after year. Our bodies are strangers, the skin philo. Enter at a new point where memory resigns to shadow and dreams. Data reshapes to music hums undertones our ears, soothed to forget without remorse. Nothing says we cannot start again without pain. Even when our children feel lost, they won't hurt again. We can start at any time. You know, one of the weird fears that I have is losing my memory. And I, in a way, I wrote that poem because I was watching an elder, probably my mother, not remember things. And I was thinking, I was soothing my own fears, I think, by writing that poem and saying, yeah, your memory can start in this time, and it can start in that time. And so this poem's kind of speaking to that too. The last lesson we learn. I want mothers to sign contracts that they will take their stories with them. They won't unearth the relics of children gone or lose the imprint of their thumb on the knob of the stove in the house left long ago. I want them to hide inside prayers that hum the house in darkness and hold the silence that makes singing a miracle. Don't speak the old language, courted by melodies and incantations. Abandon the commandments that have ruled so long. Secure the drawer holding pillowcases filled with letters. Mothers have no debt on this earth. Everything is paid off. I know who I am without the dissembling of the DNA, the counting of fibers and cells and comparisons of form and skin color. Don't use my eyes to reminisce. Don't forget where you are and talk to old friends who haven't been seen in 40 years. They are not here. I am. Mothers, you can go. Hard as it is to keep the trunk packed tight, load into infinity, carry it off to wherever is afterwards, or forget about it altogether. As much as we whisper to you, we really can't hold all that there is. Don't remind us that the dying have no regrets. Nothing can be done. Sorrow can only be felt by the living.
I love that you said that in a way you were talking to yourself about memory, because I feel like so much of Borderline Fortune is also me talking to myself about memory. I'm going to read a few pieces. And one of the things I mentioned at the beginning, that my father was killed when I was 23, and he had lost his mother when I was 4. And that sent him on this relentless genealogical quest. And when I say relentless, by the time he died, he had more than 30,000 names of my direct relations on both sides of the family cataloged. And he became this hub for genealogists around the world. And this was before Ancestry.com. Like, people weren't spitting into test tubes. This was him, flying to libraries and looking through microfiche and trying to, decode handwriting on handwritten censuses, and just an intense obsession. And so in that first poem that I read, where I said, I came here to conjure you, when I originally was writing that piece, I was thinking about speaking to my ancestors. I thought I was the conjurer. And then as I started thinking more about the story, I realized that my father was conjuring. Even though he was this very rational mathematician, he was trying to conjure, and he was trying to bring his mother back. And then I thought more about my mom's side of the family, and my maternal grandmother was one of the people who took care of me when I was growing up. And she was very religious, but she also read tea leaves and put curses on people. And I realized she was a kind of conjurer as well. So some of that energy is in these next few poems. Until the magnetic pole reverses, no amount of trying will summon you a mother. Until the Arctic ice returns to its sheets and the calving thunder cracks backward. Haul yourself out, one frozen leg at a time. I lift the ban. If you are gone, you will speak your own language. You broke my mother, and so you broke me, lost in the thicket of your misfortune. Sharp, brittle branches, sticky with bird shit, dusted with gray down. If I had a child, she was already mine. We did it backward, skipping time. The mouth of the Duwamish smells like creosote, gravel yard, freight train on a rusted trestle. We lashed a raft together and set off paddling. I wasn't yet born. The water, dried salty, reliable, cold. Who were we thawed, rebounding from retreated glaciers? You were snow on the red tile porch, outliving your generation, holding fast the prophecy of your death in gnarled stick fingers, resisting the melt until August, then sublimating into air. After hate, lies twine into granite, brine into mineral creatures made of lace. On the other side of ice, invention, your ulu, reindeer fur, and walrus stomach traded for a crisp apron. I went on a growing up adventure too, into the hearts of children, where I fear I'm lodged, all shrapnel and good intention.
So what happened to the stuff your father collected? That's my first question, and I have other questions.
Well, there's still a lot of it. Some of it exists online. To my great dismay, because we couldn't get into his Comcast account, his big website where he'd put everything went down. But I realized that some pieces of it are still available in other ways. It was a very kind of old school, early internet endeavor. So he had a web ring, and there was something called, I think it's called Ancestry Web. And so even though his website went down, all of the entries are available. So it's kind of funny. I can search for his email address and find little emails that he sent to people trying to figure out, what various fifth cousins 4 times removed were doing, because that's kind of how far off he was in the weeds by the time he died. But then some of the objects are still around as well, like my great-grandfather's surveying equipment, or on one side and on the other side, pieces like of ivory that my one of my great-grandfathers carved while he was in the Bering Strait with his co-teacher, who was a Inupiat man who was there to interpret for his students. And that's where we kind of get into the occupation and, the colonial aspect of what you and I are talking about from very, different directions and places and times. My great-grandfather was a committed socialist and wanted to be of service to mankind. That was his express purpose of going. And by all accounts, he got along well with his students. And I've actually been in contact with the granddaughter of his co-teacher. And she always says, Roy was a good man. And that's something that I've grappled with, though, in this book. It's that individual versus collective, and intention versus results. And that's very much on display in that story. It was always told to me as an adventure story. But one person's adventure, right, can be the ruin of whole societies. And so he was maybe individually having good intentions, but went there as an agent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs to work as a government school teacher. And that was not a positive thing for Alaska Native peoples. It wasn't. And so that comes up in one of the poems I read, of going on a growing up adventure. But I also, to expand it to the ecological, since you and I have been talking about that as well, I think about the unintended consequences that we've had on the earth, and where he was in Ingalik, Little Diomede Island, is a perfect example of that. Because when he was there in the early 1900s, they would have a solid freezer on the island for the winter, and they'd walk across the ice to the mainland to get the mail, to go hunting. And the last solid freeze that I've heard of was in 2012. So we've had 9 years of water crashing, up against this exposed island. And to me, it's very emblematic, again, of those unintended consequences and how cataclysmic they can be and how they accrete over time and over generations. I don't think anybody intended to melt the ice. I don't think he intended to be a cog of colonialism. I'm not sure he had that awareness. And here we are. So,
well, there are two points I want to bring out here. One, I was reading Appropriate last year, and one of the things, maybe she said it in a conversation, maybe she said it in class, or in the book, but Paisley Rekdal says, you're doing what you can with the knowledge and awareness you have at the time that you have. And then you look back and you say, okay, I'm not going to be that person again. And that's where, you can feel that responsibility. So he was moving from a purpose that he thought was good in a way that, what were the other options, at that point. But the thing I want to bring up, and this kind of connects to it, in these poems, we always think of ice as a way of preserving. And ice comes up a lot of imagery in your work. And we think of it as a way that we could stop time. And it's actually the signaler that time is moving too fast, and that destruction is imminent. And so I want you to talk about all those ice images that kept showing up in the poems, and the many properties that you were addressing in speaking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. So certainly I was thinking about the climate change piece of it. And like I said, there's that very tangible sign from where he was, just in a period of 114 years, which isn't very long in geological time, to have the climate be completely measurably different. And also growing up in the Pacific Northwest, on my mom's side, I'm the fourth generation of my family to live in West Seattle, and other places, the sea level is rising relative to the land. And that's a concern in Washington as well. But the land is actually still rising in the Pacific Northwest. It's still rebounding from the last ice age millennia later. So I was very curious about and trying to grapple with, how am I rising out of my ancestral legacy? And, I am doing so with compassion and also with clarity, which I think is a project that you and I are both involved in. And that's kind of that line I talked about, with This House, My Bones, in having intense empathy and intense specificity without falling into despair or bitterness, but also not turning away from any of the damage. And there's so much damage that's been done. And so, I would agree with you with that reading of my great-grandfather, that I think he was doing the best that he could, or he was doing what he thought was right at the time. And there's this accumulation of legacies, and not just that one, through my family, and looking at mental health issues and substance abuse issues, and thinking about how those are accreting over time. And so I'm fascinated by ice because I'm concerned about climate change, but also just the way in which the frozen land of Alaska has played a part in my family. On my father's side, there was that great-grandfather, and then my grandfather, and then my dad, all living in Alaska. And, my dad lived in a Quonset hut on the permafrost. And he tried to plant watermelon seeds thinking that they would grow. He lived in 21 houses by the time he was 19. So he wasn't going to have watermelons because they weren't going to stay long enough. But also you can't grow watermelons in permafrost, obviously. But there's another example of just this intense change just from when he was a little kid there in the 50s to now, where the permafrost is subsiding in these massive ways. Like the ice was holding up the land to the point that they could build roads on it and houses and buildings. Right. And it's giving up. Yep. Because of us. And, these huge lakes are forming and things are eroding. And it reminds me of, falling into the ocean, right? When your foundation is on something that isn't sustainable, which is a literal description of what's happening to parts of the California coast. But of course, there's also a ideological piece of that and a personal piece of that about, what do we have when what we've pinned our beliefs on starts to crumble away, which kind of goes back to that question of home again. I'd still love to hear you talk about home versus homeland, because I have some ideas through your poems of what that means, but I'd rather not put words in your mouth.
Well, yeah. Home. I don't want to make it too specific because I really want home to generate out of what people need it to be, right? When I talk about putting the daughter on your shoulders, hoping that's home enough for her when she feels for something familiar, and that's all she has. So so I think home is not structure but qualities. So it's the quality of belonging, it's the quality of being safe, it's the quality of having, and this is why we stop calling the unhoused people homeless, because we know that they can be enjoying these qualities as well. And so I think of home as not a structure of bricks, but a structure of these virtues and these qualities and these ways that we gather. Homeland is it's the source of who we are in terms of what geography we belong to, what our water feels like, where our feet feel rooted, what terrain our eyes are used to seeing, and in the more practical sense, where our language is spoken, where the things we eat are grown. So it's a natural connection to a very specific place. I saw a movie about Syrian refugees once, and they're in an airplane being sent back to Syria after climbing over all of these mountains to get to Italy. And the daughter and the family looks up and she says, "The sky has no borders." And she keeps, she's confused. So how do we know when we're flying through the sky when we've gotten back to what is our place? And I thought, well, that is the way we need to look at the world. And it shows up in my poem, by looking at the sky and then not seeing those borders anymore. But that's again, I don't want these to be too specific because everyone will build it the way they need to build what home is. But I think homeland is DNA based in our nervous system and so on. And I remember before I went to Lebanon, I went to the Southwest and I looked at the rock formations and it felt really like home. And then I went to Lebanon and saw the similar terrain and I'm like, oh, that's why I connected. And that's why a lot of immigrants end up recreating their villages in places that look exactly like the places that they came from, So I don't know, does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. And it ties back to that idea of common humanity, which I think is something that you're gesturing toward so much and, grappling with so much in your work. And then the permeability between humanity and landscape. So that's a place where I felt like our work was in conversation in interesting ways that I might not have thought about if we hadn't started reading our poems up against each other. But yeah, that illusion of separation. And on the one hand, it's really important to look at our differences, collectively, individually, within families, look at, we aren't all coming from the same place. We're not all having the same experience. And also to reach across those divides. There's a way, again, like I said, you don't flinch from the specific while also, even in your answer, trying to make sure that it's inviting and it's inclusive and it's really lovely. I appreciate that so much.
I have one question about, this is from the first set of poems, about being you use the word orphaned. And I was wondering if you see orphaning similar to becoming a refugee or an exile. Is there a kind of detachment or a fissure that happens that's similar, that causes the same repercussions?
Yeah, I don't know that I can speak to the experience of, literal political exile or refugee status, obviously, but I do think that emotionally there's that resonance between our books, that sense of rupture, and then a sense of working toward what do we carry on our own backs or within our own selves that remakes home. And so that's partly why I was interested your thoughts on home versus homeland, because I think both of our books are resisting a neat and tidy resolution, and they're resisting the idea that all this bad stuff happened and, but humans are so resilient, so it's all good in the end. I mean, that's certainly not what you walk away from these books with. And yet I think there is a sense of transformation through the poems and healing in spite of, what may happen. And something that I've been thinking about, maybe not as much when I was writing the book, but in having, conversations over the last couple months since it's been out, are just how little choice we have in our circumstances. So much of the time, I brought up sort of my big before after moment is losing my father. And that's not something I chose, obviously, or would choose. And that's what I got. And I had the opportunity to rise to that occasion and grow, or to just shut down completely. And I tried shutting down completely for a while. And, there's something to be said for that as a phase of grief as well. But I think I hung on to it so long that it became trauma. And then I started to see the value in grief of the naming and of the inventorying and of the memory. And that's one reason why I'm so interested in, your work around memory, and hearing the speaker kind of argue with herself often about, I don't want to remember. It's important to remember. How do I navigate those two? So yeah, I mean, what do you think about, orphaning or emotional ruptures versus, some of the political themes in your work?
Well, I think the similarity is the uninvited separation, and then what happens? There's a gap between the self and the thing that you're separated from, whether it's a country or a family. And I used to teach a class in Writers in Exile, and one of the things that would be repeated by each of them was, when they were in exile, they saw their country much clearer. So I always wonder, for the person who loses their family or parts of their family, do they see their family more clearly, or do they reshape? And that's one of the things I talk about in that last poem. We could start here and stop using that as our reference point, so it doesn't create that anxiety or keep reminding us that we're missing something. You're always looking at what we're missing, right? So you're right. I am always in conversation with myself about those things. So I see them, not having experienced either personally, I see them as in the way I observe what readers say and what people tell me. I've been teaching memoir for 40 years, so I've been reading a lot of personal stories, right? I see them as, yes, I'm going to deal with it either by acknowledging the gap and creating, connection back and move forward, or I'm going to move forward without looking back. I mean, there's not that many clear multiple choices. It's all kind of blurry continuum. But I think that one of the things that people do is they have to do what allows them to survive in the moment. So sometimes you'll see an immigrant or exile. I have a cousin who's kind of, my next book is based on her life, but 20 years in this country, left during the Lebanese Civil War. And I talked to her 2 years ago, and I said, "How are you doing?" And she said, "I'm still a stranger here." Now it's more than 20 years, because her daughters are grown and out of college. So she came, she did everything that she had to do. She works for AT&T. She's an educator. She had 2 beautiful children. They went to college and graduate school, and she still has not rooted. And it's not that she doesn't have friends or she knows the language well. She knew it before she came here, all that kind of stuff. But there's always that, feels like it's sand underneath your feet, and it's never a solid surface. And I was a little shocked by it, but not surprised, because my father lived to 104 and always described his life as the life of a stranger. And he was in this country a really long time. So I think that loss becomes a very big part of the identity. And sometimes you have to ignore it to move forward. And then you just turn around and there it is, facing you. Whatever it is that triggers it, it's facing you. And then that's when people start to deal with it. It can be 2 years, 10 years, 50 years later. And but you have to face it at some point.
I completely agree. Yeah, that's one of the things that I've been talking about around the book is denial being a adaptive human trait in the short term, and in the long term, it can be toxic and have its own gravitational pull, and at some point, the grief and transformation comes. Maybe that's a good segue into our last couple of poems around, which are kind of about those before after moments.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about After Breakfast, which is the one we chose, right, for the final part.
Yeah.
After Breakfast is about, I didn't put the epigram on here, but it was an email I got from Suhair Hamad while she was filming a movie in Palestine, and it was very dicey the way they were able to do this. They had to get all kinds of permissions and do it secretly and all this other stuff. So she emailed me a lot, and she had this favorite breakfast place in Ramallah. And I know the place, it's the Nazareth Cafe, and there's kind of a street split. And they were chasing some guy, the Israeli Defense Forces, and killed him. And then the ambulance comes to take him, and they killed the ambulance driver, or they shot the ambulance driver. So this is what that poem's based on. So it's a pretty horrible story, but a very typical one. After breakfast, what can you do but sit and survey the tracks where the ambulance had stopped yards away from the body, and see the flies gather where the driver was struck by the bullets? The smoke in the air lingers, days-old stale sorrow, the kind that settles in your throat, can't be coughed out, even when singing the old songs. They erupt from the chest, the roughest way out, the notes as hard as pebbles. Your hangout, the cafe where fool simmered fresh parsley and scallions in pots on blue flames, throws a shadow on a map of blood, drawn on the sidewalk where X, his feet are shot, where X, he is hit in the back, where X, the ambulance arrives, and X, the driver cannot navigate the storm of fire and fear, and X, the street fills with mourners, a matter of course. The words fly rocks and melodies. Each body is its own island, and waters gather round, splashing against the shores, pushing a million heartbeats against the silence, exhaling 1,000 zagluta, pumping into the lungs everything they have. Children are lost everywhere, and their bodies form land masses, a new diagram that must be inset into our geographies so we know where we stand. Sip tepid water, slow now. Wait again for the beans to cool. The metal of the spoon stains your mouth, leaves sulfur on your tongue. You cannot eat here anymore, and you cannot leave.
One day, history runs out. The schematic alone, more than everything you ever toted. The thought of your acacia grazing unfamiliar atmosphere. What dark energy you bring to expand the universe is not yours to inventory. No more testimony. What, then, was the nature of light? The new system hung incommensurate, though it had the same name, as in marriage or mother. A ripple of photons banded at the margin, where we jumped one state to another. I wanted for you the invisible door, the one you couldn't search for, the end of your breath's long hallway. So I want to thank everybody so much for being here. I know asking questions on YouTube is not always the most conducive. So I think we managed to fill the time where if anything pops up, we're happy to answer. Otherwise, I just want to thank Book Passage again so much, and Elmaz so much. I mean, it's really been such a gift to have this time. And I think the pandemic has shown us that community is really important, and there are creative ways to be in community even at a distance. And this is an example. This kind of programming is an example. So I really encourage people to show Book Passage some love. Hopefully we've piqued your interest in our books, but Book Passage has a huge catalog online, and I think it's just really important to buy your books from the places that are making the magic and putting on great programming. So just nothing but gratitude, so much gratitude and respect to you, Almaz. It's just been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
I've got chills. I'm not kidding. I thought it was such a beautiful conversation. I feel so honored to be here. Thank you, Teresa, and thank you, Book Passage, and everybody who attended.
Absolutely. Well, that absolutely sounds like my thing. You heard the ladies, everybody. We have the books linked in the chat. It's the big wall of text that I just posted over and over again. You can go to either of their books. We posted just one each, but I feel so that's enough. But if you'd like to find anything else, you can find it at bookpassage.com. And if you're here and thinking to yourself, I am so sad that I missed the beginning of this conversation, well, that's the beauty of YouTube. Not only will it be recorded and up right when I am done with this, take this offline, which will be in about 5 minutes or so, but right now, if you want to, you can click this little red bar right here and just zoop it all the way back to the beginning, and you can watch it all over again from the beginning, or from wherever you came in at. It's the beautiful, wonderful thing about YouTube. But before you go, thank you very much for coming to our talk tonight. I had a really wonderful time. I hope you all had a good time as well. Thank you for supporting Book Passage, particularly any independent bookstore that's coming through. Thank you for the people that are saying welcome in chat and stuff like that. I wish we had some questions, but thank you for being here. Is just the same. We're glad just to see your bright and smiling chat bubbles. Other than that, I really do hope to see you in the next one. I really, really appreciate it, everybody. Bye.
Good night.